Last night I watched Quatermass and the Pit, but would it earn itself a Quaterpass, or would it turn out to be the Pits? Hi guys, so before we get into it, the usual reminder that you'll find all my other Hammer reviews in my Hammer playlist, and there will be spoilers today. This movie is a whopping 53 years old, so this is the third film in Hammer's Quatermass series. I bet there are some people who are not even aware that there were two previous Quatermass films before this one that came out in the 50s. They were black and white and they starred a different guy in the lead role. I've seen both of those earlier films and I really enjoyed them. I think they stand up even today. So I was definitely curious about checking out this third film, although I figured that it would have a very different feel to it being made 10 years down the line. This one would be in black and white. Like I said, different actor in the lead role. But it's certainly it's certainly a film with a good reputation. I'm a member of various Hammer groups on Facebook, and every now and again you always get somebody popping up to say that Quatermass and the Pit, great film. So I was definitely optimistic. This was directed by a guy called Roy Ward Baker. Now, when I looked this guy up on Wiki, to my surprise, it turned out that he directed one of my favourite horror films of all time, Asylum, a horror anthology film from the 70s. He also did Vault of Horror, and he must have impressed Hammer with this, because after Quatermass and the Pit, he would go on to direct several other Hammer films throughout the earlier part of the 70s. He also did that famous Titanic film, A Night to Remember, from the late 50s. So, great director. And we've got a great cast as well. There are a number of really high-profile names in this. We've got James Donald, who was in The Great Escape, one of my favourite war films of all time. We've got Andrew Keir playing Quatermass. Now, this is a guy who was in many, many Hammer films throughout the 60s. We've also got Barbara Shelley, someone else who was in tons of other Hammer films. I always find it comforting when Barbara Shelley is in a Hammer film. She's just got that way about her. She's a very classy woman, classy actress. She never does anything spectacular in any of her roles, I find, but she's still someone I like to see in films like this. And I'll throw one more name at you. Julian Glover. This guy needs no introduction. He's been in James Bond, he's been in Indiana Jones, he's been in Star Wars, he's got a CV from the heavens. So, on the whole, great cast. The plot for this mostly takes place underneath London in the underground subway system. They use a fictional train station for this, Hobbs End. I find that a little bit of a shame. As somebody who is a fan of the London Underground and trains in general, I think it would have been cool if they'd have used a real station, you know, and given some fame to that station through this movie. It would be cool if you were riding through, say, I don't know, Baker Street, and you'd be able to say, "Ooh, this is like the Quatermass station," you know. But I guess if they'd have used a real station, they wouldn't have been able to make the outside shots look realistic, because I think they were using a set for the exterior shots outside in this movie. So, okay, they've gone for a fictional station. It's not the end of the world. So, in the story for this, they're building a new tunnel, an extension for the local routes, and the workmen, they come across some ancestral remains and a strange metallic object. That they just pull this stuff out of the mud. It looks suspiciously like the same sort of runny mud that they used in Diamonds Are Forever, you know, Blofeld's Doubles factory. It wouldn't surprise me if they used the same mud company for diamonds that they did on Quatermass and the Pit. So this stuff that they unearth, it's Martian in nature. That's what we find out a bit later on. And we slowly unravel this sinister plot by the Martians for this tech to take over the minds of local humans and have them turn against other humans. So it all gets a little bit Village of the Damned by the end of the film, but with adults. Watching it in 2022, it's nothing that we haven't seen before, but I imagine back in '69, this was quite a fresh thing to watch. And certainly, I think reviews for this film were, and I'm talking critical reviews now, were very, very positive for this back in '69. I must admit, it took me a little bit of time to get used to Andrew Keir playing Quatermass in this. It's not like Brian Donlevy was amazing in those first two Quatermass films. This has never been a franchise where the main character is the best thing about it. It's a little bit like the Da Vinci Code franchise in that respect. You know, you don't turn up for the boring Robert Langdon, you turn up for the stories. But certainly, by the time I got halfway through Quatermass 2, I'd really got used to Donlevy being that character. You know, for me, he is my Quatermass, essentially. So It took me a little bit of time to adjust in this one. I don't know if Don Levy was even in consideration, to be honest, to come back for this film, given that they'd left it so long between the second film and the third film. But he was quite old already when he did Quatermass 1 and 2. I think he was roughly 60 when he did those films. So by the time they got to this one in 67, did I say 69 earlier? By the time they got to this one, probably this guy was like close to 70. And I think Don Levy actually died in 1972. So probably he was just too old to be doing a feature like this. It's a shame, though, that he couldn't come back and cap off this trilogy. It's not like this was a physical role. You know, Quatermass in this film, he spends most of it just walking around in a trench coat, just shouting at people. Even at the end, when somebody's required to climb up a crane, it's not Quatermass that does it, it's one of the other characters. But if you look online and read about the production of this film a little bit, Don Levy's not even mentioned as somebody who was possibly in the running for this film. There are various mentions of other actors who almost beat Andrew Keir to the role, but Don Levy seemingly was not even in the conversation. In terms of the film itself, it's a very slow-moving, middling sort of film. I wasn't expecting that. I thought this would be a much more bombastic affair. I thought that it would seek to sort of outdo the first two Quatermass films, with it being in colour and with cinema having moved on from the 50s to the 60s. I thought this was going to be like the Goldfinger to Quatermass 1 and 2's Dr. No from Russia with Love. You'll either understand what I'm talking about there or you won't. Probably I'm throwing too many James Bond references in there today, but what I got instead of that was a film that's actually quieter than the first two films, if that's possible. It's all set in the same location. It's very low-key. The story really meanders for quite a long time. It's only really in the last 10 minutes that things kick into gear. Nigel Neal did write it. He wrote it originally as a television serial in the early 60s. It took a while for it to get to that, from that to this film in 67, but it doesn't surprise me that it started off as TV material. Nigel Neal, I don't know everything there is to know about this guy, but I did hear one story about him. So he would go on to write the original script for Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, and apparently when he turned this script in, they said to him basically, look, this is too slow. You've got to make it more like an 80s horror film. You've got to put more oomph into it, more spark. It's too cerebral as you've written it. And so Neil was absolutely appalled by these comments, allegedly, and just walked off the project, and we ended up with a completely different Halloween 3. But even though I like Halloween 3, I still don't consider it to be a particularly frenetic, action-packed horror film, really. So I really wonder what that original script looked like that Neil did. But certainly I'm not surprised that he wrote this film. Clearly he was a guy who really favoured story and character over action and kills. You know, he didn't really feel the need to necessarily have all that stuff in his scripts. I'm not saying this is a bad film, but certainly it's a film that threw me off a little bit when I was watching it the other night, because I was expecting something different to what I got, and certainly I was knocked off my stride for a lot of it. I think this is a film that I would enjoy a lot more the second time around, when I'd know what I was getting. It's a little bit similar to my experience with another film that takes place actually in the London Underground, a film called Deathline starring Donald Pleasance. With that film, I was expecting a cannibal, splattery horror film, and what I got was something a lot more subtle. But when I watched that film the second time, I was much more able to appreciate the nuance and the art of that film and what they were going for, and I suspect that it will be similar with Quatermass and The Pit for me. Although certainly I think Deathline is the better of those two movies, even if that is a little bit like comparing apples and oranges. The special effects in this are both brilliant and terrible. Let's start with the brilliant. So at the end of this, we see a kind of spectre of a Martian rise up above the London rooftops, and this thing is absolutely terrifying. It's just the way that it sits there and doesn't do an awful lot. It's probably not a complicated effect, but it's extremely effective, I've got to say. It sort of reminds me of how I felt when I first saw the big Christmas pudding monster, as I call it, at the end of Quatermass 2, or the slimy creature that you see in the rafters at the end of Quatermass 1. But I did say there were also bad special effects. I refer mainly to a scene about halfway through this film where the characters are all sat around in front of this TV monitor. And on this monitor is showing a flashback of a time previous on Mars where some kind of genocide happened between the various alien factions. I'm not sure how it got onto this TV monitor. I think it's telepathic somehow. But this scene is meant to be really emotional. As humans, we're meant to be watching what's going on the monitor and just feeling extremely ashamed that something like this could happen on any planet. But it's all completely lost because of just how bad these miniatures are. They're like little toys. They're just being moved around in the gravel, and it just completely takes you out of the scene. It's really bad. They've tried to hide it a little bit by muffling up the screen as if there's like lots of static and the signal's not coming through very clearly, but I can still see it very, very clearly, and it just destroys the scene for me. Funnily enough, a little bit earlier on, we see larger versions of the alien dead bodies being carried out of the spaceship thing, and those look quite good. It's like the art department did quite a good job with those, spent a bit of time on them, and they look pretty decent. But those smaller aliens on the TV monitor, just absolutely awful. There's another funny scene I wanted to talk about where this guy is brought into the action to drill further into the metallic object thing, spacecraft, whatever you want to call it. But the thing that he uses is like this little Black & Decker drill, and it's attached to all this complicated looking equipment that stretches all the way up to street level, and there's like a generator up there. And I just don't understand why all this stuff is needed for this tiny little drill at the front of it. I'm thinking to myself, could he not have just used the drill with batteries and not needed all this stuff that's attached to it? Because all this machinery is meant to make you think, oh, this is going to be really powerful. But the drill has just got this tiny little tip at the front of it. For all that equipment and machinery, I'd be expecting the tip to be like that thick, for it to be like a really big industrial drill sort of thing. But it's just really odd that the drill is that small. I don't know if back in the 60s they didn't have like proper drills and stuff, but watching it in 2022, it's just a little bit strange, certainly. In terms of performances in this film, I wouldn't say there's any great standouts. Everybody does a pretty good job. I do like Julian Glover's death. That is absolutely worth waiting for. I think Barbara Shelley comes out of this film really well. Like I said earlier, when I think of her, I generally would think of the Gorgon or Dracula Prince of Darkness, but going in reverse, if I started out by thinking of the Gorgon and Dracula Prince of Darkness, I wouldn't necessarily think of Barbara Shelley. I'd be more likely to think of Cushing or Lee or the Gorgon creature itself or Dracula, if you know what I mean. But with this film, I think it's a little bit different as far as she's concerned. I think she gets a bit more to do in this film than she normally does. And so when I think of Quatermass in the Pit in the future, I might actually think of Barbara Shelley before most of the other actors. So before we wrap up, I will quickly show you the version of the film that I've got for this. Here is my Blu-ray copy of Quatermass and the Pit. This was done by a company called Vintage Classics, and the picture quality on this is absolutely stunning. It is fantastic, and there are a number of features on this. So we have all new interviews with Judith Kerr, Julian Glover, Mark Gatiss, Joe Dante, Kim Newman and Marcus Hearn. Even better, there's an audio commentary track with Roy Ward Baker and Nigel Neal. I would really like to listen to that, actually. I would really like to find out a bit more about Roy Ward Baker, the guy who did one of my favourite horror films of all time, Asylum, and it would be fascinating actually to hear Nigel Neal speak a little bit about this film. There's also a trailer, there's an alternative American credits, whatever that is, an alternative American trailer and a World of Hammer sci-fi episode, and something else I noticed on the back of the box as well. When it's giving the little description of what the film's about, it says that this film takes place at Hobbs End, Knightsbridge, London. So they've made a fictional train station, but they've set that fictional train station in a very specific, real place in London. I've been to Knightsbridge, and I've even been on the tube at Knightsbridge, and I can't remember what the real station is there, but I've been on it. It's just really weird that they would very specifically pinpoint an exact part of London and then make up a station for it, which obviously is not in that place. But anyway, whatever. Let's get to the bag of terror and find out what sort of score I'm going to give for this film. So we got 1, 2, 3 bloody axes out of 5. A decent movie. It's definitely got the potential to get better for me if I were to give it a second shot, but I still don't think I liked it as much as those first 2 black and white Quatermass films from the 1950s. Right, I'll be back soon with another Hammer review. Until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.